May 4, 1945. A narrow mountain road above the town of Kufstein in the Austrian Tyrol. An American tank officer named John Lee, a stocky, cigar-chewing lieutenant from the small town of Norwich, New York, watched a German staff car climb toward his outpost under a white flag. Lee had been at war long enough to know what a white flag usually meant in those final days. It meant surrender. A German officer would step out, hand over his pistol, and join the long grey columns of prisoners shuffling west, while the Third Reich came apart around them. That was the script. That was how the war was supposed to end for the men on the losing side. But the officer who stepped out of that car had not come to surrender. He was a major in the German army named Josef Gangl, a man his soldiers called Sepp. He was 34 years old. He wore the German cross in gold on his tunic, an award given for repeated bravery in combat, and he had earned it the hard way, across 6 years and 3 fronts. He had fought in the invasion of France. He had fought in Russia. He had fought in Normandy and survived the slaughter of the Falaise Pocket. He had fought in the Ardennes that winter, in the offensive the world would later call the Battle of the Bulge. By every measure that the German army used, Sepp Gangl was a model officer and a dangerous enemy, and he had driven through his own lines, under a white flag, to ask the Americans for help, not to lay down his arms, to pick them back up, on the other side. He wanted the Americans to help him defend a castle full of prisoners against an attack that was coming from his own countrymen. He wanted Lee to fight beside him, German and American together, against soldiers of the Waffen-SS. What happened over the next day and night, on a rocky hilltop in the Alps, would become one of the strangest engagements of the entire Second World War. It was a battle in which American tankers, German soldiers, an anti-Nazi officer of the SS, Austrian resistance fighters, and a group of famous French prisoners would all stand on the same wall, firing in the same direction, at the same enemy. It is remembered today as one of only 2 known times in the whole war that American and German troops fought side by side, and it is the only known time that a serving officer of the Waffen-SS fought on the Allied side. This is the story of how that happened, and why. If this kind of history matters to you, a like genuinely helps the channel reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. Now let us go back and understand how enemies ended up sharing a wall. To understand the battle, you have to understand what the war had become by the spring of 1945. The dividing lines that had defined the conflict for 6 years, the simple geometry of Allied against Axis, German against everyone else, were dissolving. Adolf Hitler was dead. He had taken his own life in his bunker beneath Berlin on April 30th. The Soviet flag flew over the German capital. In Italy, the German armies had already surrendered. In the West, American and British forces were rolling across the collapsing Reich almost faster than they could draw the maps. The formal surrender was only days away. Everyone could feel it. But a war does not stop cleanly, and the Austrian Alps in that final week were among the most dangerous places left in Europe. There was a reason the fighting did not simply fade out there. For more than a year, Allied intelligence had been haunted by the idea of a so-called Alpine fortress, a national redoubt in the mountains of southern Germany and western Austria, where the most fanatical Nazis were supposed to make a last stand. The redoubt was largely a myth. It was never seriously built. But the Nazi propaganda machine had encouraged the rumor, and Allied commanders took it seriously enough to send major forces driving south into exactly this region. So in the first week of May, the Tyrol was crowded with 2 things at once. It was full of retreating German soldiers who only wanted the war to end, and it was full of die-hard units who intended to keep the killing going to the very last hour. Authority itself was breaking down, and that breakdown is the key to everything that followed. There were now 2 kinds of German soldier left in those mountains, and the difference between them was about to decide whether dozens of people lived or died. There were men like Sepp Gangl, professional soldiers who had concluded that the war was lost, that Hitler was gone, and that the only honorable thing left to do was to keep people alive through the chaos that was coming. And there were the fanatics, units of the Waffen-SS, the armed political wing of the Nazi Party, who intended to fight to the end and to kill anyone who tried to stop them. There were standing orders, traced back to Heinrich Himmler himself, to execute civilians who showed any sign of surrender. In village after village, men of the SS shot people for hanging out a white sheet or an Austrian flag. They hunted deserters and hanged them from lampposts and trees with signs around their necks. The Reich was dying, and parts of it meant to take as many people as possible down into the grave. In the middle of all this stood a place called Schloss Itter, Castle Itter. It sat on a steep wooded knoll above the village of Itter, about 5 kilometers south of the town of Würgel, in the North Tyrol. A fortress had stood on that rock since at least the year 1241, but the building that crowned it in 1945 was much newer, a tall stone manor rebuilt in the 1870s with thick walls, a deep dry moat, and a single strong gate. It had once been a place of music. The celebrated pianist Sophie Mentor had owned it from the 1880s, and the composers Franz Liszt and Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky had both been her guests there. A young Arthur Rubinstein had played its piano. It was, by its nature, a beautiful and isolated place, hard to reach and easy to defend, which is exactly why the SS had taken it. In early 1943, on orders that traced back to Himmler, a senior SS general named Oswald Pohl requisitioned the castle, and within weeks, it had been converted into a prison. It was placed under the control of the Dachau concentration camp, roughly 145 kilometers to the north, and it became a special kind of holding pen. Around 20 guest rooms were stripped down and turned into cells. Coils of barbed wire were strung along the walls. This was not a death camp. It was something the regime had a particular use for. It was a prison for hostages. The Germans called such people honor prisoners. They were men and women too famous or too valuable to simply murder, people the regime wanted to keep alive as bargaining chips, to be traded or displayed if the situation ever demanded it. The man placed in charge of this prison was an SS captain named Sebastian Wimmer, and he was no minor functionary. Wimmer was a former Munich policeman who had served in the camp system before, including at the Majdanek camp in occupied Poland, and as a senior officer at Dachau itself. He had a reputation for brutality. Under him was a guard force of around 25 men, mostly older soldiers of the SS Death's Head units, the branch that ran the concentration camps. For 2 years they kept watch over one of the most remarkable collections of prisoners anywhere in Europe, because the people gathered behind the walls of Castle Itter were extraordinary. The roster read like a roll call of the French establishment that had governed France before its defeat in 1940. 2 former prime ministers were held there, and the bitterness between them is part of this story. The first was Édouard Daladier, the man who had signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938, the agreement that handed part of Czechoslovakia to Germany in the failed hope of avoiding war. The second was Paul Reynaud, who had succeeded Daladier as prime minister in 1940 and who had wanted to keep fighting Germany rather than seek an armistice. The 2 men blamed each other for the catastrophe that had befallen their country. Reynaud held Daladier partly responsible for France being unprepared. Daladier resented Reynaud in turn. Even in captivity, sharing the same prison and the same enemy, they ate at separate tables and barely exchanged a word. There were soldiers among the prisoners, and they were no less distinguished and no less divisive. General Maxime Weygand had been the supreme commander of the French armies in the final, hopeless days of the 1940 campaign, and he had been one of the strongest voices for surrender. General Maurice Gamelin had held that same supreme command at the very start of the German invasion, and his failure to stop the breakthrough had helped doom the country. The 2 generals and the 2 prime ministers carried between them the entire argument over why France had fallen, and they had carried that argument into prison with them. There was Léon Jouhaux, one of the most important trade union leaders in French history, a man who years later, in 1951, would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He was held with his devoted secretary, Augusta Bruchlin, who would later become his wife. There was Michel Clemenceau, the son of Georges Clemenceau, the ferocious old prime minister who had led France to victory in the First World War. Michel spoke fluent German and had often served as the prisoners' spokesman to their captors. To understand why these particular prisoners were such prizes, you have to remember what had happened to France 5 years earlier. In the spring of 1940, the German army had done in 6 weeks what it had failed to do in 4 years during the First World War. It had broken France completely. Gamelin had been the commander when the German tanks came pouring through the Ardennes and split the Allied armies in two. He was dismissed in disgrace, and Weygand was rushed in to take his place, only to preside over a collapse that could no longer be stopped. Reynaud, as Prime Minister, had wanted to fight on, even from France's colonies if necessary. He was overruled, resigned, and the country signed an armistice that left most of it under German occupation and the rest under a collaborationist government based in the town of Vichy. So the men gathered at Castle Itter were not random celebrities. They were the living embodiment of the French defeat, the leaders who had presided over the worst military catastrophe in their nation's history, and the regime had kept them precisely because of what they represented. Their fame was their value, and their fame was also, now, their danger. There was Colonel François de la Roque, a complicated and controversial figure, the leader of a large right-wing political movement in pre-war France, who had nonetheless run an intelligence network for the Allies, and had been arrested by the Gestapo for it. There was Marie-Agnès Caillot, the elder sister of Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, imprisoned alongside her husband Alfred in the war's final weeks as the regime reached for anyone connected to its enemies. There was Marcel Granger, a relative of the Free French general Henri Giraud, and there was Christiane Mabiret, the young secretary, and later the wife, of Paul Reynaud, the woman who would write, in English, the desperate appeal for help that one of the prisoners would carry down the mountain. And there was a tennis champion, Jean Borotra, known across Europe as the Bounding Basque, one of the finest players of his generation and a winner of major championships on 3 continents. He had served for a time in the Vichy government as a commissioner of sport, then fallen from favor and been arrested while trying to slip across the border to join the Allies. Remember the tennis player. His name is Borotra, and his moment in this story is coming. When it comes, it will decide everything. These were the people behind the walls of Castle Itter in the first days of May 1945. Famous, fractious, elderly in many cases, divided by old political wars even inside their shared prison, and they were about to be left almost completely undefended. The collapse arrived from several directions at once. On the 2nd of May, a strange and grim event took place inside the castle itself. Eduard Weiter, the last commandant of the Dachau concentration camp, had fled south to Itter with his retinue ahead of the advancing Americans. There, at the castle, he died. By most accounts, he took his own life, one more functionary of a dying regime, choosing death over capture. 2 days later, as American forces drew nearer still, the castle's own commandant, Sebastian Wimmer, understood exactly what awaited a man who had run a Dachau prison. So he packed up, took his wife, and fled into the mountains. The guards, the older Death's Head men, followed him out the gate not long after. Within hours, the prison that had held some of France's most important citizens simply had no jailers left. The prisoners were, for the first time in years, alone. And alone, in those mountains, in that week, was an extremely dangerous thing to be. For the prisoners, the days when their guards melted away were not a relief so much as a new kind of terror. They had followed the slow collapse of the Reich on a radio they kept hidden from the guards, and they knew exactly how little time was left and how dangerous the final days would be. A guarded prison at least had rules, and a value the regime wished to preserve. An abandoned one had neither. The famous men and women of Castle Itter understood that an unsupervised group of SS fanatics, with the war collapsing around them, might decide on any given afternoon to come up the hill and shoot everyone inside, rather than let them be liberated. So they did something that prisoners almost never do. They prepared to fight. It was the old soldiers among them, the generals who had spent their lives in uniform, who pressed hardest to break open the castle's weapons store and arm whoever could hold a rifle. These were men in their 60s and 70s, long past any battlefield, And yet it was their instinct, when the guards vanished, to reach for weapons rather than simply wait and hope. That instinct may well have saved them, because by the time the fighting started, they were not helpless captives. They were part of the garrison. The prisoners understood the danger perfectly. They knew the fanatical SS units roaming the valley would not see them as bargaining chips. They would see them as witnesses, as trophies, as loose ends to be erased before the Americans arrived. So even before the last guards had gone, the prisoners had begun trying to save themselves. And the men who saved them were not the famous ones. They were two of the lowest-ranking people in the entire castle. The first was a Yugoslav named Zvonimir Chuchkovic, a Croatian member of the communist resistance who had been put to work in the castle as a handyman and electrician. On the 3rd of May, Chuchkovic talked his way out of the gate carrying the letter Christian Mabire had written, an appeal for help in English, on the pretext of running an errand for the commandant. The nearest town, Virgil, was held by German troops, so he could not go there. Instead, he set off down the mountain and turned north up the valley of the Inn River, walking and hiding for many hours, covering a distance of more than 60 kilometers in the dark, heading toward the city of Innsbruck, where he had heard the Americans might be. By that evening, he reached an advance unit of the American 103rd Infantry Division. He had done it. He had carried word of the prisoners out of the mountains. The Americans he reached did try to help, and what happened next shows just how confused the front had become. A small rescue effort was organized from the Innsbruck side. A German-speaking American officer named Major John Kramers, who worked in military government, pulled together a column and pushed toward Itter, even bringing along an American war correspondent and a photographer to record whatever they found. But the column was shelled on the road near the town of Jenbach, and then it was ordered to turn back, because it had crossed into territory assigned to a different American division, and the commanders could not agree on who was responsible for the rescue. Chuchkovic had walked 60 kilometers and reached the right people, and still the relief stalled at a line on a map. He had no way of knowing whether his desperate night journey had accomplished anything at all. He had done everything a single unarmed man could do, and it had very nearly not been enough. The castle was running out of time, and it still had no defenders, so a second messenger went out. On the 4th of May, a Czech cook named Andreas Krobot, another of the castle's worker prisoners, was sent down the mountain on a bicycle. He was told to find the local Austrian resistance, and he did. In Virgil, Krobot made contact with members of the underground who had been quietly working against the Nazis, and the resistance, in turn, took him to a German army officer they had been secretly cooperating with for days. That officer was Major Sepp Gangl. This is the point where the two halves of the story finally reach for each other. To understand why Gangl was willing to do what he did, you have to understand the man, because his choice did not come out of nowhere. He had been a soldier almost his entire adult life, joining the German army in 1928, long before the Nazis came to power. He was an artilleryman by training. He had fought through the great campaigns of the war, in France, in the Soviet Union, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and he had been decorated again and again, receiving the Iron Cross in both classes and, only weeks before, the German Cross in gold. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of experienced, committed officer the regime depended on. But by the spring of 1945, Gangl had seen enough. Posted to Virgil in command of a small force, he had been ordered to defend the town to the last and to blow up its bridges to slow the Americans. He refused to carry out an order that would only bring destruction down on a town full of civilians for no purpose. Instead, he made secret contact with the Austrian resistance, led locally by a man named Alois Meyer, and began quietly handing the underground weapons. When Krobot reached him with the news that the famous prisoners up at Castle Itter were now without guards and exposed to the SS, Gangl did not hesitate. He decided to defend them. But he had only a handful of men, a dozen or so soldiers, and he knew that would not be enough against a determined SS assault. He needed armor. He needed the Americans. And so, on the afternoon of the 4th of May, Major Sepp Gangl did the thing that opened this story. He found a vehicle, tied a white flag to it, and drove north toward the American lines to ask his enemy of 6 years for help. Which brings us back to Lieutenant John Lee on that mountain road above Kufstein, and to the question of how an American tank company had come to be sitting there at all. By early May, the American armies were advancing so fast into Austria that units were constantly leapfrogging one another and handing off sectors. Lee's 12th Armored Division had pushed deep into the Tyrol, and his small group of tanks was holding near Kufstein, waiting to be relieved by the infantry of the 36th Division coming up behind them. It was, in effect, a pause, a quiet moment in a fluid front. That is the situation Gangel drove into with his white flag. Lee himself mattered enormously here, because the rescue would turn entirely on his willingness to do something that was not, strictly speaking, his job. Lee came from Norwich, in upstate New York, and he had graduated from Norwich University, a school with a long military tradition, before being commissioned as an officer in 1942. He commanded a company of Sherman tanks in the 23rd Tank Battalion of the American 12th Armored Division, a unit nicknamed the Hellcats. He had already seen heavy fighting. In the brutal battle around the town of Herlesheim that winter, he had earned a Bronze Star. He was aggressive, profane, hard-living, and completely trusted by his men, who called him Captain Jack, even though his actual rank at the time was still lieutenant. When Gangel explained, through the strange courtesy of that white flag, what was happening up at the castle, Lee did not treat it as a trick or a trap. He listened, he believed it, he went to his own headquarters, got permission, and decided to lead the rescue himself. What followed was almost comic in its improvisation, and it tells you everything about how broken the front had become. Lee first set out with a small column of Sherman tanks and a group of American infantrymen, among them several African-American soldiers from an armored infantry battalion who rode atop the tanks. But the route to the castle crossed a bridge that looked too weak to bear the full weight of the armor, so most of the force had to turn back. Lee pressed on with a single tank, his own, a Sherman that his crew had named Besotten Jenny. With him went a small group of American soldiers, Major Gangel, a German driver, and a truck carrying about a dozen of Gangel's own German artillerymen. American and German vehicles climbing the same mountain road together toward the same fight. A second Sherman, this one called Bosche Buster, was left behind to help guard the approaches and the town of Vögel. That decision would matter enormously the next day. About 6 kilometers from the castle, this odd little column ran into an SS roadblock. The Americans and Germans together scattered it and pushed on. As darkness fell on the 4th of May, they reached the gates of Castle Itter. Lee drove Besotten Jenny across the wooden bridge into the castle courtyard and positioned the tank to cover the main approach. More help trickled in through the night. 2 more of Gangel's soldiers arrived, along with a teenage Austrian resistance fighter, and inside the walls, Lee discovered that he was not the first soldier to have taken charge of the defense, because there was already a German officer organizing the prisoners, and he was not an army man like Gangel, he was Waffen-SS. His name was Kurt Siegfried Schrader, and he held the rank of Hauptsturmführer, the SS equivalent of a captain. Schrader's path to that courtyard was as strange as anyone's. He had been born in the city of Magdeburg, had joined the Hitler Youth as a boy and the SS in 1937, and had become a serious combat officer. He had fought with an elite SS Panzer division in Normandy, where he had been severely wounded, and he had been sent to the quiet area around Itter to recover. During that convalescence, something had happened to him that the regime had never planned for. He had spent time around the French prisoners, talking with them, especially with the German-speaking Michel Clemenceau, and he had come to despise what the Nazis were doing in the final days of the war. When the guards fled and the prisoners realized they were defenseless, several of them had gone to Schrader and asked him to take charge. He had agreed. He had even moved his own wife and children into the castle for their protection. By the time Lee arrived, Schrader had already opened the castle's weapons store, armed the prisoners, and begun preparing positions. Among the Americans who climbed that mountain were several African-American soldiers from an armored infantry battalion, men who served in a United States Army that was still segregated, and who rode into the fight atop the tanks all the same. The garrison that would hold Castle Itter was, from the very start, as unlikely a mixture of men as ever defended a single position. The story belonged to all of them, including the ones history did not bother to name. So consider the garrison that now held Castle Itter on the night of the 4th into the morning of the 5th of May. There was Lieutenant John Lee, American, in overall command of the defense. There was Major Sepp Gangl, German army, serving as his second in the field. There was Hauptsturmführer Kurt Schrader, Waffen-SS, directing the prisoners and advising Lee on the ground he knew far better than the Americans did. There were only a handful of American soldiers, fewer than a dozen. There were roughly a dozen German army soldiers. There were a few Austrian resistance fighters. And there were the French prisoners themselves, elderly statesmen and generals, and a tennis champion, several of whom now took up rifles and submachine guns and prepared to fight for their lives. In total, the people able to defend the castle numbered only a few dozen. Out in the dark, an SS force several times their size was gathering for the assault. The night was not silent. SS scouts probed the approaches to the castle in the hours before dawn, testing the defenses, looking for weak points, trading occasional fire with the men on the walls. Lee used the time to organize what he had. He placed his single tank at the gate, where its gun could cover the road any attacker would have to climb. He spread his handful of Americans and Germans through the windows and along the parapets, trying to cover every angle of approach across a building never designed for a modern firefight. Schrader, who knew the ground around the castle far better than the Americans did, helped position the defenders where the terrain gave them the best chance. The castle itself was an ally in this. Its old strengths, the deep dry moat, the single gate, the thick walls, were the same features that had made it a fortress 7 centuries earlier, and they would buy the defenders time when the morning came. But everyone on that wall understood the basic problem. There were too few of them, the enemy had artillery, and no one knew whether help was coming. It is hard to overstate how impossible this picture would have seemed at any other moment in the war. For 6 years, the soldiers inside that castle had been trying to kill one another. Sepp Gangl had fought the Western Allies from Normandy to the Ardennes. The American tankers in the courtyard had spent months killing German soldiers, exactly like the ones now standing beside them. Kurt Schrader wore the uniform of the most ideologically committed military organization the Nazi regime ever produced. The same organization that was, at that very moment, sending men up the hill to storm the castle and kill everyone inside. Every law of the war, every assumption about who belonged on which side, was suspended on that hilltop. And it held, because by that point the real dividing line was no longer about flags or nations or uniforms. It was about something far simpler. It was about whether you would kill for a cause that was already dead, or whether you would stand and protect the lives that were in front of you. The men coming up the hill had made the opposite choice. They were soldiers of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, a formation that carried the historic German name Götz von Berlichingen. The division had been raised in 1943 and had been badly cut up in the fighting in Normandy the year before, but it was still SS, still committed to the end. The senior SS commander in the wider area was an experienced and heavily decorated officer named Georg Bockmann, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, a man who had served in the concentration camp system early in his career and helped form one of the SS Death's Head divisions. The force that closed in on Castle Itter numbered somewhere between 100 and 150 men, and crucially, they had brought heavy weapons up the mountain. They had machine guns, they had a 20mm automatic cannon, and they had an 88mm gun, the famous German artillery piece that could double as an anti-tank weapon and punch through armor with terrible ease. The attack came at dawn on the 5th of May. The morning opened with machine gun fire raking the walls. Then the heavier guns joined in. The 20mm cannon and the 88mm gun began to chew at the old stone, sending splinters and shattered masonry flying through the courtyard. Falling rubble injured Schrader's wife inside the castle. The defenders fired back from the windows and the walls, the Americans and Germans and French all working their separate weapons toward the same tree lines where the SS were closing in. For all their differences, they fought as one garrison. The fighting did not end quickly. The SS pressed the castle through the morning, working their guns closer, raking the walls, trying to find a way through the gate or over the moat. The defenders held them off hour after hour, but every hour cost them ammunition they could not replace, and every hour the lines thinned as men were wounded and as cartridges ran low. The old castle did its work, soaking up shell fire and forcing the attackers to come at the defenders through the narrow killing ground of the approach. But stone walls do not shoot back, and the people behind them were running short of everything that did. Then the 88 found its mark. A shell struck besotten Jenny squarely, and Lee's Sherman, the armored heart of the entire defense, was destroyed in an instant. There was only one man aboard at that moment, a radio operator trying to fix the tank's radio, and by remarkable luck he escaped without serious injury. But the tank was finished. The defenders had lost their single greatest weapon, and they had lost their radio with it. Now they could not even call for the relief they so desperately needed. Lee had a few dozen people, ammunition that was dwindling fast, and an enemy with artillery battering down the walls around them. And the famous prisoners fought, not in some symbolic gesture, but with weapons in their hands, at the windows, under fire. Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister, took up a submachine gun and fired from a window. Michel Clemenceau, the son of the great wartime leader, fired on the attackers. Colonel François de la Roque fought, and Jean Borotre, the tennis champion, fought as well. Édouard Daladier, the other former Prime Minister, the rival who would not share a table with Reynaud, spent the battle carrying ammunition to the men on the walls, returning again and again to the castle's arsenal to keep the defenders supplied. Men who had governed France, who had commanded its armies, who had won its championships, were now firing weapons and hauling cartridges in a desperate fight for their own survival, their old quarrels forgotten for as long as the shooting lasted. It was during this fighting that the defense suffered its most painful loss. Major Sepp Gangl, the German officer who had set all of this in motion, who had driven under a white flag to bring the Americans into the fight, was watching over Paul Reynaud when an SS sniper found him. Gangl was trying to move the former Prime Minister out of the line of fire when the bullet struck him. He was killed almost instantly. He was 34 years old. Of all the defenders of Castle Itter, across that long morning of fighting, Sepp Gangl was the only one to die. A German major, decorated by Hitler's own regime, fell protecting a French Prime Minister in a battle fought alongside American tankers against the soldiers of the SS. There is no cleaner illustration of what the war had become at the very end. By now, the situation inside the castle was nearly hopeless. The tank was gone, the radio was gone, the ammunition was running low, and the SS were preparing to bring an anti-tank team right up to the gate to blow it open. Lee was already planning a last stand, a fighting withdrawal into the castle keep where the defenders could hold out for as long as their bullets lasted. The arithmetic was simple and grim. Without relief, and soon, Castle Itter would fall, and everyone inside it would be at the mercy of men who intended to show none. There had been one telephone in the castle, and earlier, before the radio died, Schrader had directed Lee to it, and Lee had managed to get a single call out to the resistance and the Americans down in Vergel before that line too went dead. But there was no way to know whether anyone was truly coming. The defenders needed a runner. They needed someone to get out of the besieged castle on foot, cross open ground swept by SS fire, and physically reach the American forces to lead them in. It was almost certainly a suicidal task. And this is the moment the tennis player had been waiting for, though no one had known it. Jean Borotre volunteered. Remember who this man was. In the 1920s, Jean Borotre had been one of the most famous athletes in the world, one of the celebrated Four Musketeers of French tennis who dominated the sport for a decade, a champion at Wimbledon and beyond, nicknamed the Bounding Basque for the explosive, leaping style of play that delighted crowds across Europe. He was a world-class athlete, one of the fastest and most agile players who had ever lived. Now, in his late 40s, he put that body to its final and most important use. He went over the castle wall, dropped to the ground, and ran. He ran through the woods and the open fields below the castle, eluding the SS troops who would have shot him on sight, sprinting across the very ground the enemy was trying to seize. And he made it. Borotra reached the lines of the American 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division. There, in a small twist of fate, he was recognized by a French-Canadian reporter traveling with the Americans, a young man named René Lévesque, who decades later would become the Premier of Quebec. Borotra pulled on an American uniform, and rather than rest after his run, he turned around and helped guide the relief column back toward the castle he had just escaped. The relief came in the middle of the afternoon, and it came with almost no margin to spare. Inside the castle, the defenders had reached the end of what they could do. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their tank was a burning wreck, and they were bracing for the final rush that would have overwhelmed them. American tanks and infantry of the 142nd Infantry Regiment shot their way up the road to the castle. Leading part of the column was the 2nd Sherman from Lee's original force, the one that had been left behind to guard the bridge, Boucher-Buster. Just as the SS anti-tank team was preparing to breach the gate, the American column burst onto the scene with guns blazing. The SS, caught between the castle's defenders firing down on them and the fresh armor arriving at their backs, broke. They melted into the woods. The siege was over. When the lead tank reached him, Lee, in the dry humor of a man who had spent a very long day expecting to die, reportedly greeted his rescuers by asking what had kept them. When the dust settled, the numbers told the story of just how close it had been, and just how complete the victory was. The defenders had held a castle for the better part of a day against a force several times their size, equipped with artillery they could not match. Around 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner in the aftermath, and the attackers had suffered dozens of casualties. Every one of the French prisoners, every former prime minister and general and labor leader and tennis champion had survived. The only defender killed in the entire battle was the German major who had brought the Americans into it. The immediate aftermath was almost quiet by comparison. The captured SS men were rounded up and marched off. The exhausted defenders, the Americans and the surviving German soldiers who had fought beside them, were loaded onto a truck and driven back down out of the mountains toward Kufstein, where the German troops who had just helped save a castle full of French notables were turned over as prisoners of war. The strange logic of the last days giving way again to the ordinary categories of victor and vanquished. The French prisoners themselves were taken down to the city of Innsbruck and then started on the long road home. For them, after years behind the wire, the war was finally and truly over. 3 days later, on the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. The German surrender took effect, and the guns across the continent finally fell silent. The battle for Castle Itter had been fought in the very last hours of that war, in a moment when the old certainties had already crumbled and something stranger had taken their place. It was one of the very last battles of the war in Europe, and it remains one of the only times in the whole conflict that American and German soldiers fought as allies. That claim is worth getting exactly right, because the real history is more interesting than the simplified version. Castle Itter was not the single only time German and American troops cooperated in those final days. Just a week earlier, in the last days of April, American soldiers and German army troops had briefly worked together in what became known as Operation Cowboy, an effort to save a herd of rare and valuable horses, the famous white Lipizzaner stallions, along with a group of Allied prisoners from a stud farm in occupied Czechoslovakia before advancing forces could reach them. There too, German soldiers had crossed over and fought alongside the Americans against a common threat in the closing chaos of the war. So Itter is best understood as one of only 2 known occasions in the war where Americans and Germans fought side by side. But Castle Itter holds a distinction that is entirely its own. It is the only known battle in the entire Second World War in which a serving officer of the Waffen-SS took up arms on the Allied side. That officer was Kurt Schrader, and there is no second example of it anywhere in the record. What makes the battle stranger still is that it did not need to happen. By the 5th of May, the war was already decided. Nothing about that small fight in the Alps changed the outcome of the Second World War by a single hour. No general had planned it, no headquarters had ordered it. It served no strategy and altered no map. And that is exactly why it matters so much. Castle Itter was not a battle fought for advantage. It was a battle fought for people, by men who had every reason to stand aside and let the last days run their course, and who chose instead to risk their lives for strangers when there was nothing left to gain. Strip away the strategy, and what remains is the rarest thing a war can produce, which is a group of armed men choosing mercy when they could just as easily have walked away. So why did it happen? Why would Sepp Gangl, a decorated German major, turn his weapons around at the last minute and die defending his enemies? Why would Kurt Schrader, an officer of the SS itself, take up the cause of French prisoners against his own organization? Why would American tankers risk their lives, so close to the end, so close to going home, to save a castle full of foreign politicians they had never met? The answer has nothing to do with strategy, or orders, or military advantage. It has to do with a choice that became possible only when everything else had fallen away. For 6 years, these men had been defined by their uniforms. The uniform told you who your enemy was. It told you whom to obey, whom to fight, whom to kill. But by the first week of May 1945, the structure that gave those uniforms their meaning had collapsed. Hitler was dead. The government was gone. The chain of command had dissolved into chaos. And in that vacuum, each man was suddenly thrown back on a more basic question, a question armies are usually very good at preventing their soldiers from ever having to ask. The question was simply this: when all the orders are gone, what do you actually stand for? The fanatics of the SS gave one answer. They chose to keep killing, to defend a cause that was already dead, to drag as many people as possible into the grave before the end. They had been shaped so completely by the regime, conditioned so thoroughly to obey and to destroy, that they could not stop, even when stopping was the only sane thing left to do. Their loyalty was not to any living thing, it was to an idea, and the idea demanded death. But men like Gangl and Schrader gave a different answer. Stripped of the regime that had commanded them, they discovered that what they truly valued was not the cause at all. It was human life. It was decency. It was the plain refusal to let helpless people be murdered in the war's last days. And once they had made that choice, the American uniform across the courtyard was no longer the uniform of an enemy. It was the uniform of the only people who could help them do the one decent thing left to do. There is a further piece to this that is easy to miss. Every German soldier had sworn a personal oath, not to Germany, not to a constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself, by name. That oath had been the chain that bound the army to the regime through every horror of the war. And when Hitler died on April 30th, that chain, for many soldiers, simply broke. The man they had sworn themselves to was gone. Whatever Gangl and Schrader had believed when they first put on their uniforms, by the first week of May, there was no longer any living authority commanding them to obey. They were free, in a terrible and sudden way, and freedom forced a choice. The fanatics used that freedom to keep killing. Gangl and Schrader used it to keep the people around them alive. The same collapse that released the worst impulses in some men released the best in others. And Castle Itter is where you can see both, on the same hilltop, on the same morning. That is the deepest truth of Castle Itter. By that final morning, the old categories, Germans against Americans, the Allies against the Reich, had stopped meaning very much at all. What remained was a choice each man made on his own, about the kind of person he wanted to be when the war that had defined his entire life finally ended. And when you see it that way, the impossible picture of an SS captain, an army major, and an American tank commander standing on the same parapet stops being a contradiction. It becomes the clearest statement imaginable of what a few human beings can choose, even at the very end, even when everything around them has trained them to do the opposite. The people who lived through that day carried it with them for the rest of their lives, and their later stories say as much about the battle as the fighting itself does. Sepp Gangl was buried in Wörgl, the town he had refused to destroy. Austria did not forget him. He is honored there as a hero of the Austrian resistance, a German officer who turned against the dying regime to protect Austrian civilians and the prisoners in his care. A street in Wörgl was named after him, the Sepp Gangl Straße, and many years later, a memorial plaque was dedicated to him in Germany as well. He left behind a wife and 2 children. The sniper who killed the only defender to fall at Castle Itter killed the one man whose change of heart had made the entire rescue possible. But the choice Gangl made outlived the man, which is perhaps the most any soldier can hope for. John Lee, the cigar-chewing tank commander from upstate New York, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest decorations the United States Army can bestow, for his leadership in the rescue and defense of the castle. He was promoted to captain at the end of that month, the rank his men had been calling him all along. After the war he went home to Norwich, the same small town he had come from, and lived a quiet civilian life, far from the strange hilltop in the Alps, where he had once commanded Germans and Frenchmen and Americans all at once. He died in 1973. For many years his extraordinary day was barely known outside his hometown, a story that sounded too unlikely to be true. Kurt Schrader, the SS officer who had chosen the prisoners over his own organization, faced the reckoning that came for nearly everyone who had worn that uniform. After the war, he was sentenced to a term of imprisonment for his membership in the Nazi Party and the SS. But his actions at Castle Itter were taken into account, and his sentence was reduced in recognition of what he had done. He lived on quietly into the 1990s. He had, in the final accounting, used his position to save lives rather than take them, and that fact followed him for the rest of his days. Georg Bochmann, the SS commander whose men had attacked the castle, survived the war as well. In its final days he refused orders he considered suicidal from a senior German field marshal, was relieved of his command, and surrendered to American forces shortly after the fighting ended. He, too, lived on until 1973. Sebastian Wimmer, the brutal commandant who had fled the castle and left his prisoners to their fate, was captured after the war and held for a time. Then, in one of the stranger turns of the whole affair, several of the former Itter prisoners interceded on his behalf, and he was released by the French in 1949. He drifted back toward his old life, working as a laborer, drinking heavily, his marriage gone, and in 1952 he took his own life in his Bavarian hometown. The French prisoners went home. They were brought down out of the mountains and eventually back to France, reaching Paris on the 10th of May 1945, just 2 days after the war in Europe ended. There they returned to the lives and the rivalries that captivity had only interrupted. Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, the 2 former prime ministers who had refused to share a table, both went back into French politics and held office again in the post-war years. General Weygand and the tennis champion Jean Borotra both faced post-war accusations connected to the Vichy government, and both were ultimately cleared. Léon Jouhaux went on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951 for his lifelong work on behalf of workers and international peace, with Augusta Brüchlen, by then his wife, at his side. The young reporter who had recognized Borotra, René Lévesque, returned to Canada and a political career that would one day make him one of the towering figures in the history of Quebec. And the 2 prisoners who had walked and bicycled out of the mountains to bring help, the Yugoslav handyman, Zvonimir Chuchkovich, and the Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, are the quiet hinge on which the whole story turns. They were among the lowest-ranking people in that castle, men with no fame and no title, and without their courage on the roads below Itter, none of the famous defenders would have had any chance at all. It was an electrician and a cook who reached the outside world. It was a German major, an SS captain, and a tennis champion who held the wall. The rescue belonged to all of them, and to the men whose names never even made it into the records, the ordinary German soldiers and American troops who simply stood their posts and fired when the morning came. History remembers the prime ministers and the generals and the tennis champion, but the wall was held by farmers and clerks and mechanics in uniform, on both sides, whose names are gone for good. Castle Itter still stands above its village in the Tyrol. It is privately owned now, and closed to the public, an ordinary quiet manor on a wooded hill that gives no outward sign of the impossible thing that happened there in the final days of the war. For a long time the battle was nearly forgotten, remembered mostly in the unit histories of the men who had been there, and in the memories of the French families whose relatives had survived it. In more recent years it has been recovered and retold, most fully in the careful work of the historian Stephen Harding, whose research pinned down who was present, what each of them did, and just how close the defenders came to disaster. From there, the story has spread far beyond the history books. It has been set to music by a well-known band, dramatized for the screen, and shared by millions of people who could scarcely believe it was true. The story has reached a wider audience than it ever had in the lifetimes of the men who fought it. And what they leave us with is not a lesson about tactics, or armor, or the movement of armies. The battle for Castle Itter endures because it is proof of something we almost never get to witness so clearly. It is proof that decency can survive even the total collapse of everything built to suppress it. In the wreckage of the worst war in human history, with no orders left to follow and nothing left to gain, a small group of men from opposite sides of that war spent their last hours of combat shielding people who could not shield themselves. They won no territory and shortened no war. And yet their stand remains one of the very few things to come out of those years that is simply, uncomplicatedly good to remember. That is why the story refuses to fade. Not because of the castle, or the famous names inside it, but because of what a handful of ordinary soldiers proved was still possible at the very end of everything. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men, and with this strange, true story. If it reached you, a like is the simplest way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not yet subscribed, this is a good place to start, and the bell will make sure the next story finds you. I would like to hear from you in the comments. If your own family carried any story out of the Second World War, a father or a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor whose history you grew up hearing, tell me about them. Most of those men never told their stories in full. This is how we keep them from being lost.